Watching the crew anchor the boat down by the side, Shiro glanced at Stanley and Nantien. Let's get going. Shall I try to scan the whole island so that we can get a general idea on how big this place is? Shiro asked as Stanley furrowed his brows. It's hard to regenerate mana in this place, so you might want to be a bit more conservative with your mana, Stanley replied as Shiro only nodded her head. I know, but you see, I'm a little different. I have two, no, technically three kinds of energy in me. The first kind is, as you know, mana. The second is something I like to call celestial energy. The third and last one is what I like to call divine energy, since it comes from my divinity. I'm able to fuse all three or use them separately when I wish. My divine raiment uses celestial energy, and I can boost some spells by using divine energy that comes from my divinity. There is also my passive, called Chosen of Nature. With this passive, my health and mana regeneration is massively increased in a place with lots of nature rather than man-made constructs. And while quite a few of my spells are restricted, I can say for sure that my health and mana regeneration is rather impressive, despite being a little slow, Shiro replied as Stanley paused. Wait, what? You have three types of energy, and you have a spell that lets you regenerate mana and health in this situation? Stanley asked with curiosity and disbelief. Yep, and you also said you have divinity, right? Yep. Oh, I haven't told you just yet, have I? I've attained divinity, or rather, I'm a demigod now. I've attained this after I completed the trials at Mount Olympus, Shiro replied. Taking a moment to digest this information, Stanley furrowed his brows. So you're a half-god now? What exactly does having divinity do for you? It would be helpful to know when going through this island, Stanley asked. Just as Shiro was about to reply, she realized that she didn't know much about being a demigod herself. Well, so far, I only know that I can imbue one of my forms with divine energy and ascend it to demigod status. I haven't tried it out yet, so I should probably give it a try soon. It only lasts for an hour and the cooldown is 3 days, Shiro replied after a short pause. We'll probably try it out today on this island, but make sure you're careful of where you use it, since it's a powerful tool. If we waste it on some cannon fodder, it would be a shame, Stanley reminded as Shiro nodded her head. Don't worry, Teach. Speaking of which, you also completed the Olympus trials before, right, Nantien? Shiro turned to Nantien, who nodded his head. I did, but it wasn't anything too major. Nothing like what you and the party obtained. Nantien smiled softly as Shiro only shrugged. A shame, then. Anyways, since you have been here before, do you want to lead the way, Teach? Shiro asked as Stanley nodded. Last time I was here, I only explored a small part of this island, and that was the chamber within the biggest mountain on this island. I found quite a few paths leading deep underground, but I didn't get a chance to explore them, he explained, as they walked. The island itself was rather large, and it was constructed of 3 different mountains, a large forest surrounding each one and a beach that loops around the place. Walking through the forest towards the center of the island, Shiro could definitely feel her external regeneration of mana halt completely, and she could only rely on her internal regeneration. This was slightly problematic, since it means that she'll need to manually provide the mana for her nanobots. After all, when they detach from her, they use the ambient mana to sustain themselves. With the ambient mana gone, it would only take them a few moments before fizzling out. Thinking about it for a moment, Shiro decided to experiment a little. You, too. Come here for a second, Shiro called out as both Nantien and Stanley glanced toward her. I want you to wear this for now. I know it looks like police cuffs, but trust me, it's not what it seems, Shiro said while showing them 2 cuffs. She was connected to one part of them, while the other was meant for them. Raising his eyebrow, Nantien placed it on his arm and immediately felt a surge of mana. Lil Tien, you're full on mana right now, so you're fine. When you're low, put this on and you can recharge. I'm passively regenerating mana, unlike you two, so I'll be the rechargeable battery for now. Shiro grinned as Nimue laughed at her description from within the mana realm. Ronbes. So after all, she wasn't wrong. Placing the cuffs on his wrist, Stanley could see his MP increase as the transfer speed was quite fast. How much mana do you have? Stanley asked as he couldn't believe how much mana he was receiving. More than 10 billion. Why do you ask? Shiro tilted her head. Nothing. Shaking his head, Stanley removed the cuffs once he was full. When they arrived on the island, he had sent out a constant scan to see if there was any danger nearby, but there hasn't been so far. Naturally, he was also careful with his mana usage. But now that Shiro had revealed that she could recharge their mana without too much worry, he could be slightly more aggressive with scanning the island. We're pretty safe for the next few miles or so. I haven't detected anything just yet, Stanley said as Shiro nodded her head. Glancing around them, Shiro smiled, taking a deep breath. A Tier 6 magic circle wrapped around her hand as she slammed it down against the ground. Suddenly, a web of nanobots surged out. As if they were a colony of ants, they skittered throughout the island while staying connected to her. What are you doing? Stanley asked. I'm taking a scan of the island. Normally I can just do this with a snap of my finger, but since this place doesn't have any ambient mana, my nanobots would be destroyed once they detach from me, Shiro explained. Raising her spare hand, a hologram was slowly constructing itself with each passing second. Looking at the hologram with surprise, Stanley couldn't believe how helpful the nanobots were. They almost seemed omnipotent in his eyes. With how Shiro was using them, sensing his gaze, Shiro only sighed. Teach, I know you think the nanobots are omnipotent, but they really aren't. You see, if I don't have any blueprints in my mind for the things I construct, I wouldn't be able to make them at all. Nanobots are very literal. The parts have to work properly when creating the item, or else it'll just self-destruct in front of you. Without the blueprints, the most I can be is a caveman waving around a stick. Nanobots are so much more than that, but the prerequisites of using it and utilizing this element properly are very stringent. The only reason it looks omnipotent to you right now is because I have access to quite a few blueprints as well as the experience. Hell, without my computer-like memory, it'd be hard for someone to use it like I do, since they could forget an important part within the blueprint. Miss out a single part and the object is useless, Shiro explained with a shake of her head. The nanobots were hard to use due to the high requirement to use efficiently. If she didn't have her amazing memory, she would have long forgotten so. Many of her blueprints from Arya. Hell, she wouldn't even be able to create her guns at will, since she'd be busy recounting all of the information regarding how the gun was made. Since they're rather high-tech and compact, creating them would be quite slow on top of a high risk of failure. Hearing her explanation, Stanley understood that he was viewing things at a surface level and not the effort required behind the scenes. Sorry about that. Stanley apologized as Shiro nodded her head. Man, seeing Stanley's gaze reminded her of the people who both revered and hungered for her power. Seeing such a gaze in her teacher was not something she welcomed. Furrowing her brows, Shiro watched as the scan of the island slowed down. Even if she's staying in contact with the nanobots, it was still hard to supply mana to everything without it crumbling to ash since there was no ambient mana. However, she managed to map out the first mountain, a forest, and a few caves. This is all that I can do so far. Any further, and it's too inefficient, Shiro said with a frown and glanced at her mana. Seeing that it was already drained by 30%, she could only sigh at how much mana she had used. Thankfully, she had her chosen of nature to help her out. Flexing her fingers, she created 2 more wristbands which had the map projected onto them. They can choose to expand the hologram if they want. Looking at the map, Stanley could spot where he had entered before. This chamber is where I was. I also managed to obtain the dagger from here. I'm not sure if it has reset or not, but if it has, we can potentially get another rainbow-grade dagger in this place, Stanley said while pointing towards a small cavity within the mountain. I can give it a scan to see if it has reset or not. If I don't sense anything in them, there's a high chance of it being reset, Shiro replied as Stanley nodded his head. Watching her send out nanobots once more, a more detailed hologram of the room appeared in front of them. Within the hologram, they could see signs of battle as Stanley recognized them to be a result of his combat against the guards. Never mind. Seems like they haven't reset. Though I suppose if you could keep getting rainbow items, it would be a bit ridiculous. Stanley shrugged his shoulder. Men, so here are the choices. We can either start exploring the mountains or go deep underground. And, I'll be honest, I think the shard could be underground since there's not much space above ground. I could also be wrong considering how many chambers there are and we haven't scanned the other 2 mountains just yet. Since we can regenerate mana thanks to my passive, do you think it's worth it to see if there are any other rainbow-grade items in the mountains? Shiro asked as Stanley nodded his head. We have a week to spend here, so visiting the 2 mountains can be done in that time. The only reason I was forced to leave last time was because I ran out of mana for my spells. But if you are around, that problem is gone. Stanley smiled as reaching the chamber last time was quite hard since he had to make sure his spells were used to their maximum potential. This meant that he had to dodge the attacks of several guards before unleashing a barrage to kill them all. Have you completely explored the first mountain, or are there more treasures to be found? Nantian asked while pointing at some of the other cavities. I've explored most of them. There are only a few weapons and armor pieces, but they're rather lackluster. If I had to describe it, it's not worth the effort. Stanley shook his head. From the way it looks, there's only one main chamber, and that is where the best items are stored. If we're going to the other mountains, we should put our focus in reaching the main chamber rather than the smaller ones, Shiro suggested as the 2 nodded their heads. Anything you can tell us about the guards? Nantian asked curiously. They don't use spells, and they just charge at you with the intent to flatten you against the ground. If anything, I'll need to warn you about their physical capabilities. When I was fighting them, most of my mana was used to reinforce my body so that I could actually keep up. Even if my physique isn't as good as others, I still try to keep up. So the fact that they forced me to use a lot of mana for reinforcement should give you a bit of idea. Do not hesitate to use mana for reinforcement if you feel danger, Stanley warned with a serious expression. Nodding her head, Shiro noted her teacher's warnings down seriously. After all, his reinforcement magic on the body was quite impressive, as it allows him to surpass the average physical prowess of most Tier 5 warriors. Of course, for exceptional warriors such as her father, Stanley would have some difficulties. Making their way to the second mountain that was slightly to the back right of the first, Shiro made sure to scan the mountain. However, just as she did this, she sensed danger and immediately retracted her hand. Seeing her nanobots get fried instantly, Shiro knew that she would have been the same if she didn't retract her hand fast enough. Seems like it won't be that easy. We'll have to explore the second mountain ourselves. I think we can only scan. Once we cleared the main chamber, Shiro said as the two agreed with her theory. I just realized a small problem, Stanley said as Shiro and Nantien glanced towards him. All three of us are backline fighters. While you may be better at close combat than we are, Shiro, I'm not keen on letting you be the front line, and Nantien can probably agree with that, Stanley said as Nantien nodded his head. Fine, it'll be fine. I can handle myself just fine on the front lines, okay? Shiro shrugged. I'll take the front line. Shiro, you can be at the back, since it also means that my skill will be activated, Nantien said as Shiro furrowed her brows. However, Nantien's skill did come in handy, so it was probably a good idea to let him be the front line. Fine, but I'll be a mixed fighter then. If it gets a bit out of hand, I'll help out with some melee combat. Otherwise, I'll stay at the back and provide covering fire, Shiro said as Nantien nodded his head. If you can group them up, I'll erase them as quickly as I can then. Since I can regenerate my mana, I can afford to use some of my stronger spells. Stanley smiled. With their combat plan figured out, they approached the second mountain. How should we deal with this? Nantien asked as they looked towards the two large kneeling statues. Seeing the flickering eyes, they knew that they had to fight them. Without a proper tank, it'll be hard for them to block it, even with Nantien's skill. Obliterate it as fast as we can, Shiro suggested as Stanley agreed. Since I'm Tier 6 now, I can take one out myself. You two combine efforts to take the other, Nantien said as Shiro nodded her head, since that was probably the best setup for now. Do you know any magnification spells? Teach? Like these ones? Shiro asked as she created a few spell circles. I do, but I can probably incorporate your spells to amplify mine some more. What are you thinking about? Stanley asked, since Shiro sounded like she had an idea. Oh, nothing much. Just an advanced rail cannon. She grinned, slamming her foot against the ground. Nanobots surged around her as parts of her rail cannon started to appear, combining with one another. Stanley watched in shock as a weapon that shouldn't even exist with their current technology was created in front of his eyes. Jumping on the back of the rail cannon, Shiro made sure that she was comfortable in the seat before powering everything on. Hearing the sound of gun powering up, Stanley understood what she wanted to do and prepared the magnification spells. Seeing this, Nantien only smiled and snapped his finger. Several layers of Tier 6 magic circles appeared above the left guardian, as their eyes stopped flashing and glowed with an ominous light. Standing up, they wanted to approach the ground when Shiro only smirked and activated divine enchantment on her frozen slumber skill. Suddenly, ice chains erupted out of the space around the guards as they were frozen in place instantly. Hearing the cracking of the ice, Shiro wondered if they were going to beak out, but after a few moments, they were still stationary, so Shiro knew they were exposed for a clear shot. Glancing at each other, Shiro gave Nantien a thumbs up, signaling that she was ready. Nodding his head, he activated his spell as she fired her gun. Bang! Firing her rail cannon, Shiro watched as Stanley's magnification spells amplified the power of the blast, driving it through the chest of the guard. Watching the guard stumble back into the side of the ruins that connect to the mountains, Shiro knew that he wasn't done yet. Glancing to the side, she could see Nantien's guard melting from his attack as it wasn't able to do anything in retaliation. Glancing at her guard, Shiro gestured for Stanley to back her up as he nodded his head. Dashing towards the guard, Shiro created a Tier 6 magic circle while Stanley did the same. Flickering in front of the fallen guard, Stanley narrowed his eyes and slammed his palm into the giant's body. Shatter! He commanded. As a Tier 6 magic circle expanded out in an instant, as if reality was glass, a web of cracks could be seen spreading through the guard. Krrrr! The sound of his chassis shattering under the pressure could be heard as Shiro appeared just behind Stanley with a special shotgun in her hand. The barrel of the shotgun was long and thin, while the chamber wasn't like usual shotguns. It was similar to a revolver chamber which housed several shots. Pulling the trigger, the recoil of the gun pushed Shiro back, as a cavity was instantly created in the guard's head. Snapping her fingers, the pellets morphed themselves into razor blades and started to shred into the guard's body. After a few seconds, the guard stopped moving due to most of his body being reduced to ash thanks to the duo's attacks. Seems like you two didn't have much trouble? Nantian smiled as he walked towards the two. Well, it took more than one attack. For guards like this, I think it's better to attack their whole body rather than attack them with concentrated attacks, Shiro replied, while glancing towards Nantian's guard, who was nothing but a melted pile of mess right now. True, Nantian agreed, since he saw their fight and noticed how the guard could still move despite having a cavity opened up in his chest. Anyways, how are we doing for mana? Shiro asked, while holding out the cuffs once more. I'm all right, but entering the mountain with full strength is probably recommended. After all, we might not have time to recharge in there, Nantian said as he started to recharge his mana, while Stanley did the same, once he was sure that the two were back to full strength. Shiro dismissed the cuffs and glanced at the mountain. Now, do you suppose there's a second entrance, or is this one the only one available? Shiro asked as Stanley paused for a moment. I don't think there is. Last time I was here, I surveyed the surroundings of the first mountain, and I wasn't able to find anything of the sort. There was only one entrance, and it was also the exit. I did try to strike at the walls of the place, but they were highly mana-absorbent, and it would be difficult to carve a second entrance through this place. Even the damage I did to the walls last time was a byproduct of me using some of my strongest spells which drained my mana, Stanley replied. Anubis, we're also not familiar with the layout, so there is the chance that we could completely miss the chambers, Nantian reminded. True. Seems like it's the front door then. Shiro shrugged, since they were essentially knocking on the door of their enemy and shouting out about their entrance. Summoning her sword as a precaution, Shiro followed behind Stanley and Nantian as they entered the ruins leading deep into the mountains. The pathway was rather dark as there were no sources of light, other than the entrance, but this was also good for Shiro, since she gained a boost to her strength. Come here. Let me enchant us in case there are any creatures that are light-sensitive, Stanley said as he enchanted them with true sight. While he only had to face golems in the first mountain. He didn't know of the dangers in this mountain, so he had to be careful. There was probably a lack of light for a reason, and he didn't want to go in blind without knowing the reason behind this. Just as they enchanted true sight, Shiro could faintly hear the sound of gears moving as the entrance was sealed up. But before it could fully close up, Shiro slammed her hand down and summoned nanobots to keep the door open. Upon contact, all of the mana was drained from the nanobots, as they were reduced to ash. Furrowing her brows, Shiro quickly retracted her hand before her mana could be absorbed. Don't worry, we can probably make an exit manually at a later time if we need it, Stanley said as Shiro nodded her head. Walking through the darkness with her guard up, Shiro wasn't able to use her boundary since she can only use it when she's attacking someone. She hadn't mastered the defensive version of boundary, otherwise it would be helpful in this situation since it'll reveal enemies that can't be seen or detected with mana. As they were walking through the darkness, Shiro suddenly felt a tingle near her neck as she quickly ducked down and slashed up with her sword. Clang! Watching her sword slam against a blade, Shiro's eyes widened as cold sweat dripped down her face. Seeing that his attack had failed, the owner of the blade scuttled back into the crevices of the ruins. Despite having true sight, the darkness was still hard to see through, but Shiro knew that the owner was quite small. She wasn't able to get a good look, but it was enough for now. Be careful of the crevices. These things don't emit killing intent, nor does mana sense pick them up. Shiro warned in a hushed tone as both Stanley and Nantian frowned. Summoning their weapons, they prepared a few magic circles and scanned their surroundings. Suddenly, Shiro felt the same tingle again, but this time it was near her wrists. Quickly, retracting her hand, she was a little slow as her wrist was almost cut all the way through and her hand was barely attached. Activating her life fire, she coated her hand in fire as the wound closed up. But as the fire lit up the corridor, they sensed killing intent all around them as the three quickly grouped up with their backs to each other so that they could cover their weaknesses. Did you see anything? Nantian asked with a frown after. Seeing the cut on her wrist. Nothing. I couldn't sense anything until it was about to hit me, Shiro replied with a frown. Dismissing the light, the killing intent faded away once more, but the feeling of danger was still around, as they now know. The enemy could bypass most of their senses. Do you think we should hurry down or make our way down slowly? Nantian asked with a frown. Staying silent, both Stanley and Shiro weren't sure since the enemy was unknown. Going forward could prove to be worse, but if they stay, there was a chance for the enemy to surge towards their spot. Thinking about it for a moment, Shiro opened her mouth. Let's kill one first, so we understand what we're up against. Agreeing with her suggestion, the three kept an eye out for any suspicious movements. However, despite their guard, they were harmed quite a few times by the sudden attacks, as the speed of this foe was on a whole nother level. With the addition of not being able to sense their killing intent until the last moment, it was hard for the three of them to keep this up. But soon, their patience paid off as Shiro was able to freeze one in time, just as it tried to cut her leg off. Grabbing it with her hand, she could see that it was a golem that looked like an insect. It had 2 long blades attached to its body like wings, with several smaller blades along its belly. Similar to how her mother uses thin blades, these insects are able to strike out with impressive speeds that make it hard for them to dodge. If a whole group of these appear, it'll be hard to survive. Let's travel slowly for now and make sure that they are within sight, Stanley suggested as the two agreed. Walking through the corridors slowly, Shiro made sure to freeze them upon contact if possible, while Nantien would melt them and Stanley would shatter them to pieces. While the attacking power of the insect golems is powerful, their defenses are round. The chassis was rather weak, but their blades were strong. It was thin but highly durable. Collecting the blades, Shiro received the item named Compressed Zernic Blade. A tiny blade made from a rare metal known as Zernic. It's highly durable and can slice apart magic. However, there is a limit to how much magic it can withstand. Searching up some information about Zernic in her memories along with the internet, Shiro was surprised that she hadn't seen anything that was mentioned about this metal. Collecting as many of them as she could, she decided to save it for now and reuse it later. After all, it was able to clash against her blade without much trouble, along with cutting through her flesh with ease. If she made this into a special weapon, it could come in handy. Even when Nantien melted the golems, these blades still survived, so one could see how durable they were. By the end of the corridor, Shiro was able to collect several hundred of them. Thanks to their small size, Shiro could store them all away in a container and place it in her inventory. Glancing around with her true sight, Shiro could see that this was the only chamber that they can go to right now. With just a straight path, it was hard to miss any other paths. In front of them was a double door that seemed like it could be opened quite easily. Nodding to Nantien and Stanley, Shiro pushed the door open slowly, just as a small opening could be seen. A blade shot forward as Shiro had to quickly lean back, or else she would have been cut. Watching the blade retract, the three glanced into the room and saw a golem with 2 long swords standing menacingly in the room. Seeing 3 doors on different walls, they understood that they had to defeat this golem if they wanted to continue. Nodding to each other, they dashed into the room as Shiro activated her divine raiment, slamming her hands against the ground. Shiro was about to summon chains when the floor opened up and blades shot towards her. Widening her eyes, she quickly dispersed her body into shadows so that she wasn't harmed. Reappearing not too far away, she noticed the floor close up once more. Don't stand on the same tile for more than 1 second. It attacks you the moment you are. Seems like it's designed to fight against mages, Nantien said while dodging a few blades. Hearing this, Stanley frowned and started to reinforce his body with magic rather than casting spells. Twisting its body, the golem swung the blade towards Stanley. Even with his body reinforcements, he did not expect the blade to arrive so fast. With no other choice than to try his best to dodge, Stanley activated a shield and jumped back. Bang! Launching his body to the other side of the room, Stanley was embedded into the wall for a moment as blades suddenly stabbed towards him since he was there for more than a second. Blocking the blades with his shield, Stanley dashed to the side. With blood dripping from his lips, furrowing her brows, Shiro waved her hand as life fire erupted out around Stanley and started to heal him. While this was happening, Nantien appeared before the golem and slammed 2 tier 6 magic circles against the chest. Bang! Forcing the golem back by 2 steps, Nantien frowned. His armor has magical dampening effects. I think it's best to go for kinetic force right now since my tier 6 spells are rather weak against it, he called out as Shiro nodded her head, flickering. In front of the golem, she raised her sword and twisted her body. Activating Sylvanas' 4th ability, Shiro coated her weapon with nanotech, as the 4th ability allows her to ignore all resistance towards her element. Even if the golem was good at absorbing magic, this counts as a resistance, so she can ignore it. With a trail of silver-blue light behind her sword, Shiro cut deeply into the golem as nanobots flooded its systems. However, just as she was about to jump back, she realized that thin threads wrapped around her body and she wasn't allowed to move. Draining her mana with each passing second, she couldn't muster enough mana to shift her body to shadows. Swinging its blades towards her, Shiro was prepared to activate Grace when Nantien flickered in front of her. Bang! Blocking the strikes. With his hands, blood dripped down his arms as a torrent of flames erupted out of him, melting the threads. You okay? He asked while helping her retreat. I didn't expect him to restrain me with mana-draining threads. We'll need to be careful, since you won't be able to cast any spells if you're caught, Shiro replied with a serious expression. She wouldn't mind activating her true spirit nature, but since her nature deals with souls, it would be useless against this golem. Even though her sword ignored the golem's resistances, she could still feel her nanobots dying one by one as they lacked the mana to keep eating away at the materials. However, since the golem absorbed mana, there was surely a place which housed it, It was only a matter of finding out where it is. Once she finds out, the growth of her nanobots will increase dramatically and consume the golem in an instant. Activating analysis, a red glow appeared in her eyes as everything turned translucent. Dashing around to avoid the spikes, Shiro scanned the golem's body and found a pool of neon blue energy that swirled around for a moment before being funneled down into the ground. Narrowing her eyes, she had an idea. "Teach! Nantien!" she called out. "What is it?" Stanley replied while activating a few offensive spells that had very little effects on the golem's armor. "Do you trust me?" she asked as the two nodded without hesitation. "Of course," Nantien said as Shiro smiled. Dashing towards the golem, she could see the wires appearing once more as it attempted to wrap around her. Smirking slightly, she created a small bead of nanobots and connected a thin strand of nanotech wire to it. Throwing it towards the golem, she watched as it attached against the surface. Twisting her body, she flicked her blade and kicked the pommel. Bang! Stabbing into the golem's body, an entranceway was formed for the bead. Just as she did this, the wires wrapped around her as it started to drain her of mana. Grinning, she released more mana as a faint aura was slowly growing around her, watching. Her MP value decrease. Shiro could see the blades slashing toward her. "Protect me, but don't destroy the wires," Shiro called out as Nantien appeared before her once more and deflected the blades. "Understood." Nantien replied as he reinforced his strength as much as he could. While this was happening, her nanobots were eating their way towards where the energy was being stored. Narrowing her eyes, Shiro waited for a moment before opening her mouth. "Destroy the wires." Boom! Melting the wires in an instant, Nantien jumped back as Shiro morphed her body into shadows. As the two retreated, the nanobots found the energy pool as Shiro relinquished her control over the bots for a split moment, since she had allowed the golem to freely absorb her pool of mana. One could imagine how much mana was stored in the golem right now, as if someone pressed pause. The golem froze for a moment as the sound of gears completely halted. Bang! Exploding into a mass of nanobots, the golem was consumed in an instant as the robots surged towards the trio in an attempt to consume everything around them. Slamming her hand down, Shiro exerted her control over the nanobots, while Nantien prevented the blades from harming her. Furrowing her brows, Shiro forced her control over the mass of nanobots that was going out of control and finally stopped its expansion. Snapping her fingers, she destroyed them all in an instant as the mana that was absorbed exploded out and was reabsorbed by the walls before she could reclaim it. Clicking her tongue, Shiro glanced toward the 3 doors leading to different directions. Furrowing her brows, Shiro wanted to send out small scouts, but with the walls being able to absorb mana, doing so was quite impossible, so the best choice was still going to be exploring it manually. "So which way shall we go?" Shiro asked as they sat down in the room for now. After defeating the boss, it seemed like the tiles had stopped working since it was no longer trying to kill them if they stood in the same place for more than 1 second. We can try to go straight forward," Nantien said with a shrug, since there wasn't much they could do other than try every path until they got to the end. Seems reasonable. "After that, we can try going to the left and then the right," Stanley said as Shiro nodded her head. After resting for a moment to regenerate all of their mana, the 3 stood up and pushed open the set of doors directly ahead of them. Upon entering, they were attacked by tiny golems with more Zernic blades, which was a bit annoying to deal with, but thanks to Shiro being both the healer and the control mage, they were able to progress without having too much trouble. Collecting around 100 more of these blades, Shiro stored them away in her inventory since they could be rather helpful for the rest of the party if Helion reforges them into something else. Similar to the last chamber, there was another golem with the same properties in this room, but this time he seemed slightly faster and hit a bit harder. Discovering this upgrade, Shiro understood that they probably couldn't use the same method of killing it in the later chambers, so she decided to try her best at freezing it and shattering the pieces apart. With Nantien's magic, they were able to cause it to explode due to the sudden change in temperature. Unfortunately, the golem was still able to fight despite having a large chunk of itself completely blow off. But with the internal workings exposed, Stanley was able to use his magic to damage them all and cause fractures to spread out through the golem's body, halting its movements for good. This time, there were only 2 doors rather than 3, and they decided to take the left path. If this wasn't the final chamber, they'll try the right path before going back to the start and try out a different door. After entering the chamber following the left door, they were surprised to discover a large open area with a large box in the center. Looking around the room with true sight, Shiro could see a single door in the distance as she guessed that it was probably the last chamber down this path. Other than the door, the chamber had 6 supporting pillars with 3 on each side, and seeing the grooves on these pillars, she could guess that blades will probably protrude from the surface if they got too close. Narrowing her eyes at the box in the center, she glanced at both Nantien and Stanley. "Let's proceed with care." Nantien said as Shiro agreed. With Nantien in front, Shiro in the middle, and Stanley at the back, the three approached the box. Krrr! Hearing the sound of gears turning, the three quickly jumped back as the box started to unpack itself. Bang! Slamming what seemed to be a tail against the ground, the three could feel the entire mountain shake from the impact. Quickly creating 2 rail cannons by her side, Shiro pulled the trigger without hesitation, but just as the shots were about to hit, 2 large wings unfurled themselves and blocked the shot. Furrowing her brows, Shiro watched as several Tier 6 magic circles surrounded the golem. Krrr! Suddenly, several blades formed from light appeared and pierced towards the golem. But before they could pierce the armor, they were shattered apart in an instant. Rano esh urasha! Rearing its head back, a thunderous roar could be heard as the true appearance of the box was revealed. With a humanoid upper body, a pair of dragon-like wings, and a serpent-like lower body, they watched as orange lights could be seen flickering between the joints of this golem. Quickly activating analysis, Shiro scanned the golem's body as she was quite surprised with how it's constructed. It was highly reminiscent of some of her mechs that were in early development. Furrowing her brows, Shiro didn't know who created this, but with the advantages that it had in this area, it was going to be a hard fight if she didn't go all out. Remember when I said that I wanted to test out my demigod form? Shiro called out as the two nodded their heads. I think this is a good chance to give it a try. I just scanned the golem's internal workings, and I must say, it's not looking too good. Shiro frowned. Are you sure? Your demigod form has a 3-day cooldown, doesn't it? Nantien asked with worry, since they had so many other bosses that they needed to fight if they're not able to find the final chamber. True? We'll see how it goes then. Shiro frowned as Nantien made sense. Using it now could be akin to using a rocket to kill a chicken. But if things turned sour, she wouldn't hesitate to use her skill. Activating Sylvanas' 4th ability, which boosts an element's effectiveness and ignores all resistance, Shiro chose Error as the element. Watching the circuits wrap around the blade, Shiro smiled before summoning her bow. Pulling back as hard as she could, she activated her divine raiment while both Nantien and Stanley charged the golem to keep him busy. Reinforcing their bodies, the two summoned their weapons and spells. Suddenly, the golem flickered in front of them with speeds that shouldn't even be possible. Slamming his fists into them, the two were barely able to summon their barriers before they were launched into the walls. Bang bang! Widening her eyes, Shiro couldn't even glance towards them when the golem's chest opened and energy surged in its body. Recognizing it to be her mana, which the golems had stolen before, Shiro immediately dropped her weapon and slammed her hand against the ground. Suddenly, a wave of nanobots surged up and formed several walls. Bang! Feeling the shockwave of the blast hitting the first part of her defense, Shiro gritted her teeth and focused on trying to contain the blast, or rather deflect it back at the golem if possible. However, the nanobots were being turned to ash upon contact, so it was rather difficult. Sensing that her defenses were about to break, Shiro quickly flickered next to Nantien and Stanley. Grabbing their shoulders, she dived into the rift just as her wall of nanobots were pierced. Boom! The explosion seared Shiro's back just before the rift portal could fully close, as she quickly activated 3 charges of grace for each of them, since that punch had removed 60% of Nantien's health, while Stanley was in a worse situation. With only 15% of his health left, his face was pale as Grace managed to bring him back from the brink of death. Yeah, I'm going to use my skill here. We can't hold back against someone like that. Shiro frowned as Nantien narrowed his eyes. I'll use my berserk skills too. No, you need to save that for other bosses. If I can't handle this one, then you can use your berserk skill to help me, Shiro said as Nantien nodded his head. Let me enchant you first. Stanley took a deep breath and stabilized his mind. Unlike Shiro, he didn't have a ridiculous pain tolerance, so the initial impact had sent him into shock. Once he was calm, he reached out towards her as several Tier 6 magic circles wrapped around her body like runes, and Shiro could see a buff that increased her strength, speed, and defense by 150% for 2 minutes. Thanks, Shiro said as the 3 of them jumped out the portal. Activating her Pandora's Requiem's 5th ability on her Ascension skill, she upgraded it to the next tier as the name changed for her skill. Divine Ascension. You can imbue your current form, or an active form, with divine energy, ascending it to the status of God. Cost: end duration 10 minutes, cool down 3 days. As she activated her skill, a giant Tier 8 magic circle expanded out from her as the entire room was filled with a divine aura. Boom! A pillar of light shot into the sky as they could not see where it was leading, but they knew that her skill was probably causing a phenomenon. After all, in a place where it had no ambient mana, the amount of energy she was radiating could fill this entire island. Sensing that Shiro was trying something that was potentially dangerous for it, the golem flapped its wings in charge towards her. However, Nantien appeared before him and clasped his hands together. "Sorry, I would love it if you didn't bother her right now." He smiled as an orb of light appeared between his hands. Slamming it into the golem's body, he managed to push him back by a few steps, but it wasn't enough. Suddenly, 2 Tier 6 magic circles erupted around the golem as pillars of earth slammed into him. "Don't forget about me, either." Stanley narrowed his eyes. Slamming his hands down, 3 Tier 6 magic circles expanded out from underneath him as cracks started to show up on the golem's body. "Aim for those! They're weak points," Stanley shouted towards Nantien as his skill analyses the golem, then reveals his weakness. Nodding his head, Nantien snapped his fingers and summoned an armor made of light. Gesturing for the swords to strike towards the weak points, he muttered an incantation as Tier 6 magic circles appeared in front of the blades. As the blades passed the magic circles, they were enveloped in a white flame which increased the room temperature quite a bit. However, this was nothing as several more magic circles appeared in front of the sword. Once the sword passed through 5 of the magic circles, it transformed into a streak of light which pierced the golem's body. Bang! Forcing the golem to the ground, Nantien could see that it was fixated on Shiro. Pointing its hand towards her, hundreds of thin wires erupted out from around the room as Nantien widened his eyes. Recognizing these wires to be the same ones that absorbed her mana last time, he quickly created a mini sun near Shiro and made sure a barrier protected her so that she wasn't harmed. Watching the wires melt before reaching her, he sighed in relief. Just as he sighed, he felt danger behind him as the golem had lashed its tail at his back while he was focused on helping Shiro. Crack! Gritting his teeth, he could feel his bones fracture from the hit as his body was sent crashing against the ground. But before he touched the cold stone tiles, a cushion of nanobots softened his impact and started to heal him. Looking down in mild surprise, he glanced towards Shiro. While she was wearing the same outfit, there was a special aura around her which flickered with a silver light. Her eyes were like a galaxy of shining stars, as the area was now filled with a divine energy. That took a while to get used to, since my body is only that of a demigod. The skill says that I have 30 minutes, but I'd say I have around 4 or 5 before my body starts to break down. Shiro chuckled as Nantien stood back up after being healed. "So, what does being a god feel like?" Nantien asked with a smile. "Pretty good. I now have absolute control over the area and my divinity is in full effect." Shiro grinned as her aura seemed to fluctuate with her emotions. "Oh, what does your divinity do?" Nantien asked with curiosity. "It does this." Narrowing her eyes, she aimed her palm towards the golem before clutching it into a fist. Suddenly, the surrounding walls that absorbed mana were broken down into ash. From the ash, nanobots surged towards the golem, restraining it with ease and ate away at its body. I can now turn everything within my domain into nanobots. Well, this is only the basic benefit. I have more, but since I'm only a demigod, my overall divine energy is quite low, so I can't do what a god can for long periods of time, Shiro explained. Swiping down with her hand, the nanobots grabbed hold of the golem and ripped him in half, before wrapping around the broken pieces, consuming it in an instant. Any evidence of the golem being here was completely erased as Shiro snapped her fingers and the nanobots returned back to being the walls. Quickly deactivating her form, Shiro kneeled down on the ground as a wave of weakness washed over her. The divine energy surrounding the room faded away as the lighting disappeared returning it back to its original state of being in the dark. In that form, I was able to ignore the lack of mana in the surroundings, since my divine energy replaced it. I managed to take an entire scan of the mountain, and I found the final chamber. Shiro smiled while Nimue was working hard to make sure her body was in tip-top shape. She could only hold back her anger at Shiro for using the upgraded Ascension rather than the base one that elevated her to demigod status. Do you know how reckless that was? Imagine my face when I saw a flood of divine energy erupting out. Nimue shouted out in Shiro's mind while fixing her body as best she could. That was my bad. I got a bit too trigger-happy at being able to use my form, haha. Shiro apologized as Nimue only kicked her in the mana realm. Shoo. Let me focus on the work now. I need to concentrate so that you don't fucking implode. Nodding her head with a smile, Shiro focused her mind back to reality. So what's behind that door then? Nantien asked, pointing at the door on the opposite side of the room. Just a small treasury, nothing too fancy. The best thing there is some red equipment. I guess we can take it with us. Shiro shrugged as Nantien's smile twitched for a moment. However, when he thought about the grade of items she had on her, he realized that it was indeed nothing too fancy. After all, what is red compared to rainbow grade? Collecting a sword, a shield, and what seems to be a scroll of sorts, the three made their way back. In the end, they decided to take a break for Shiro to rest her body since it was a little painful to move, but after a few hours of rest, she was good to go again. There was the problem of her no longer being able to use divine energy for a while due to the backlash, but she wasn't too worried about that. After all, they'll be going straight to the main chamber. Again, they had to fight 2 bosses before the final guardian, but they were used to Golem's movements. Plus, things were made easier when they realized that the scroll was a study on Tier 6 magic circles, which Stanley studied intensely during their time of rest. Once he was finished, his magical prowess soared as his damage to the golems increased dramatically, making the fights easier. As for the final guardian of the chambers, with Shiro unable to use any divine energy, Nantien activated one of his berserk skills with the lowest backlash and cooldown. Shiro acted as support with her armor penetration, buffs, and healing, while Stanley reinforced Nantian's body and provided offensive spells of his own. While he didn't manage to take it down as easily as Shiro did, it was still an impressive sight to behold. When they killed the boss, they opened the final set of doors, and resting on a pedestal was a crystal arm guard which simmered with a multicolored light. Martial arm guard of the Divine One, Rainbow. Once you have used this item, you will be allowed to study under the guidance of the Divine One until you have mastered one of his techniques. There is no time limit within the space, and you will not age. You will not feel hunger or fatigue. You will not be able to leave the space until you have mastered a technique. Reading the description of the arm guard, Shiro understood that it was probably something similar to the daggers she had received, which gave her the skill Item Master. Thinking about it for a moment, she figured it was probably best for Nantien to take this, as Hiei was essentially her front line. With the age of demons and gods around the corner, having his help would be tremendous, especially with a skill that could be of equal quality to Item Master. "Nantien," Shiro called out as Nantien glanced over. What is it?" he asked curiously. "What do you think about studying under someone called the Divine One?" she asked, pointing at the gauntlets. Don't you want Madison, Helion, or your parents to have this instead?" Nantien raised his eyebrow in surprise. "Well, Mum and Dad are already well versed with martial arts. Since the age is around the corner and that we're probably going to be in a party often, having you learn some martial arts to act as my front line would be helpful," Shiro replied as Nantien nodded his head. "Are you sure? A rainbow grade item is very precious," he said as Shiro nodded his head. "I told you that I trusted you, no? You having the rewards is also helpful for me. Plus, as long as you don't betray me, I'll be happy, haha." Shiro chuckled with a small smile, handing the arm. Guard to Nantien without hesitation, Shiro made her way out of the chamber. "Though I don't think you have time to complete the test in the gauntlet just yet, since we still have another mountain to search as well as the shard of the garden to find," Shiro reminded. Sighing with a soft smile, Nantien stored the arm guard away after a short pause. "If you give me a rainbow grade item, how am I supposed to repay you?" Nantien asked as Shiro shrugged. "You know I do this without much expectation, other than that you don't betray me," Shiro replied. "But not many would give a pinnacle grade rainbow gear away." Nantien shook his head. "Of course I don't give items of this grade away at random. You know, if it was something I needed, I'll be keeping it okay." Shiro pouted slightly, seeing that Nantien had suggested that she gave items like this away without care. I don't mean it that way. I meant that most people would keep it for themselves, even if it didn't fit what they needed. The fact that a rainbow grade item even existed while most have only seen a purple grade at best is a surprise, never mind getting it. Well, most people will keep it for themselves while I'm a spirit." Shiro shrugged. "True." Nantien nodded his head. "Do you want to set up camp for a bit before we try the next mountain? Or should we go straight for the shard?" Stanley asked curiously. I'm not able to use my divine energy for a while, so we won't be able to go straight to the final chamber. It'll take quite a while, and it's probably best to notify the crew on the boat about our decision, since it might take a while," Shiro replied. It's probably best that we explore the other mountain first. Who knows if taking the shard would cause this island to become inaccessible," Stanley said as both Shiro and Nantien nodded their heads. "Sure, it'll take a while, but overall, we should have some time to spare," Shiro agreed. Leaving the mountain, the trio made their way back to the ship and told the crewmen that they were going to the third mountain as well, so it might take more than a week. Ryobi's agreeing to come back for another week once. They got some supplies. The trio rested for the night. Waking up early next morning, they watched the boat sail back to the city to resupply. "Right then, let's go to the third mountain, shall we?" Shiro smiled. The third mountain was rather similar to the second, as there were quite a few golems, but this time there was the addition of traps which fired mana-absorbent spears towards them at high velocities. Strangely enough, they seemed to breach mana too, which reminded Shiro of what her attacks are like. However, when she picked them up, they lost this property, so Shiro could guess that it was most likely the launcher that had this skill. As for the bosses, rather than giant golems, they were essentially fortress walls with weapons mounted on the top, which fired ceaselessly. It was rather difficult to dodge them all and take them out, but in Shiro's opinion, they were much easier than the big bosses. Clearing the rooms with ease, it took them 2 days before they found the final chamber, as they were quite unlucky. All of the previous chambers they entered were false and only offered some red grade items which weren't bad, but compared to what they've been getting, seemed a little lackluster. Once they killed the final guardian, they received their third, a rainbow grade item which was actually a key. However, once Shiro read the description of the key, she was glad that they decided to check out the third mountain, as they needed this in order to progress. Key to the garden. Rainbow. A key that unlocks the chamber to the garden shard. If they didn't decide to do the third mountain, they would have probably needed to brute force their way through or waste more time going out than back in. With the key in their possession, they'd cleared all 3 mountains, and only the shard remained. Do you know a way towards the shard? Nantian asked while pointing at her map. Not really. The map only tells me that it's on this island, not where the entrance is. If we want to go to the shard, we'll have to look for the entrance manually. However, I can probably scan the entire island given enough time and find the entrance. Shiro smiled. Spending the next few hours guarding Shiro, while she scanned the entrance towards the shard of the garden, Shiro found what seemed to be a staircase. Underground, that was hidden rather well within the forest. Making their way over, they moved the rubble out of the way and entered with caution. Looking at the staircase, Shiro furrowed her brows as it was strangely clean. It was as if it wasn't affected by the elements at all. The journey was rather simple, since there weren't any side doors or the such within this place. It was just a straight walk down with no distractions. Reaching the bottom, they saw what seemed to be a portal frame with no portal. Looking around the area, she saw that the portal frame was the only thing here. Do you think we need to use the key here? Perhaps, Shiro muttered while bringing out the key. Just as she brought out the key, unfamiliar magic circles appeared in front of her as it resembled a keyhole. Placing the key in the center, she watched as the magic circles started to turn. With a flash of light, a strange portal opened up in front of them as they furrowed their brows. Looking at each other, they nodded their heads and entered. Upon entering, they shielded their face from the light. Once the light calmed down, they removed their hands and widened their eyes at what they were seeing. Right now, they were floating in what seemed to be a spherical room with an orange orb in the center. Swirling around this room was motes of energy that had thin trails of light behind them. Next to the orange orb was a severely damaged statue of a woman who was missing an arm and her lower body. However, she was embracing the orange orb like it was her own child. Slowly, the statue looked up at Shiro and smiled. "So you have arrived." A melodic voice rang out softly as Shiro tilted her head. "You have been waiting for me?" she asked as the statue nodded its head slowly. "You've come to claim the shard, haven't you? Queen of the spirits, young demigod." The statue smiled as Shiro nodded her head. "Who are you?" Shiro asked. "I suppose I can be called this garden spirit. I guard the shard and preserve it as much as I can until the age arrives. I use my own life essence to stop the age from arriving too soon, but as you can see, time is running out." The garden spirit said, while glancing down at her broken body. "How long do you think there is until the age arrives?" Shiro asked with a frown. "I can hold out for at most 5 more months." The garden spirit shook her head as Shiro frowned, since 5 months was an extremely short time for the age to arrive. They needed to quickly deal with Madison's role as the demon queen in this time too. With everything combined, sorting it out within 5 months was going to be hard. Taking a deep breath, Shiro sighed. "Okay, 5 months should be somewhat doable," she muttered. Hearing this, the garden spirit smiled. "I wish you luck." With that, she let go of the orb that she had been holding on to and pushed it towards Shiro. Reaching out to the orb, she watched, as it morphed into a miniature anchor and floated above her palm. Shard of the final garden. Looking at the shard of the garden that was now in her hands, Shiro glanced up at the statue who called herself the garden's spirit. She was now in what seemed to be a fetal position with her eyes tightly shut. Furrowing her brows, Shiro wondered if there was anything she could do to help her, or rather, perhaps prolong the prep time they had before the new age. Activating analysis, Shiro peered into the internal component of the garden spirit. However, just as she did this, she felt a shock in her mind, as she was immediately blinded for a moment. Gritting. Her teeth. She accidentally took a step back as blood dripped out of her eyes. Quickly activating life fire on her eyes, Shiro healed them as she furrowed her brows. This was the first time it had ever happened, as she had never suffered such a large backlash when using analysis. "Don't try something so risky, please. My body is not for you to understand. You do not have the required authority to understand. What I am, doing so would only harm yourself." The garden spirit sighed softly. "Shiro, are you okay?" Nantian asked with worry as Shiro only nodded her head. Don't worry. You said authority, right? Do you mean system authority?" Shiro replied to Nantian before talking to the spirit. "And I do." The garden's spirit nodded her head with mild confusion as to why Shiro was curious about this. However, since this was probably the last chance they could talk to each other, she didn't mind entertaining her a little. I see. So if I have the right authority, am I able to prolong your life, or rather, delay the age so that the humans have more time to prepare themselves? Shiro asked. I believe so. Naturally, you have to be familiar with the system itself to be able to accomplish it. Even with the proper system authority, if you don't know how to utilize it, it is useless. The garden's spirit shook her head with a sigh. Grinning at her response, Shiro took a deep breath. You two might want to step back. I'm going to be borrowing some power from someone quite important, Shiro said as Nantien nodded his head and took a few steps back. When Shiro warns you, it would be in your best interest to do as she said, since she was correct most of the time. Hearing this, Stanley also stepped back since he understood that his best student had surpassed him in strength already. Despite him being able to use Tier 6 magic, she could ascend to God status any time she wished. Of course, there were backlashes, but it was still God status regardless. As a teacher, he couldn't feel prouder. Stepping back, he couldn't help but feel as though he was a spectator to a show. Normally, he would be the one at the center, but seeing someone else in that spot wasn't bad either. The pressure he felt on his shoulders lightened up as he knew there was someone after him, should he die, and that someone was Shiro. With both Nantien and Stanley a decent distance from her, Shiro took a deep breath and glanced at the skill that was listed on her status board. Blessing of Chaos, ignore all system restrictions, and be promoted to System Privilege Level 12. Cost, NA duration, 3 hours. Cooldown 3 months. With a cooldown of 3 months, she can use it for a second time before the new age starts. But if she prolonged the spirit's life, there was a chance that the time before the age would increase, which meant that there were more chances for her to use this and get used to how the system worked. Since the active duration was 3 hours. It meant that even if she couldn't help the spirit, she could find out some information about the system. Taking a few deep breaths, Shiro activated the skill. Boom! Suddenly, a pillar of light descended down upon her as divine energy filled the room. But compared to the one that Shiro released, this one was more overbearing. If they described Shiro's divine energy as one that resembled a tennis ball, this one was equivalent to a giant stadium. As the pillar of light surrounded Shiro, several Tier 8 magic circles appeared around her, as a black sigil appeared in the air in front of Shiro. Sending out a shockwave with her in the center, all of the light was shattered and only Shiro was left. With a black veil that seemed to trail behind her with ghost-like properties, Shiro opened her eyes and glanced towards her system. All restrictions have been lifted for entity Shiro. Authority level has been upgraded to level 12. What would you like to do today? Furrowing her brows, Shiro raised her eyebrow. Do not be confused. I am a personal AI of the system that you gain access at level 10. What is your query today, or do you have none? How do I help the garden's spirit? In order to prolong the time of arrival? Shiro asked. Unfortunately, with your current skill set and range of power, it is impossible. The AI replied as Shiro frowned. That is taking into consideration your divine grade skill, as well as any skill you have in the database. For you, right now, it is impossible to help this spirit prolong the coming of the new age. I see. If I were to activate analysis, would I be able to look at the spirit's body now? Oh, that is indeed possible. Nodding her head, Shiro activated analysis and quickly scanned the spirit's body. Without any backlash this time, she was able to see what she was made of, and it left Shiro speechless, with how compact she was and how quickly she was eroding away. Shiro understood why the system AI said that it was impossible. Even if it was, she didn't know where she should start with how compact she was. Is there anything I can do to help her or prolong the age of demons? And gods then? There's nothing you can do right now. I see. Well, since we're here, I might as well ask you some questions that I have. Nantien, teach, Shiro called out. What is it? Stanley replied. I'm going to see if the system AI and speak on speaker, or something, since I want to ask it some questions before I lose this power. Shiro explained. I can indeed work in a way so that everyone in the vicinity can hear me. A neutral voice rang out, and I can also just display my message on their system if you prefer that instead. Looking at the line of words, Nantien raised his eyebrow in surprise. Just speak unless you two want to read rather than listen. Shiro shrugged and glanced back to Nantien and Stanley. I don't mind. Nantien smiled. I don't mind either. Stanley nodded his head. Hearing their replies, Shiro smiled before turning to her system interface. What is the goal of the Age of Demons and Gods? Shiro asked with narrowed eyes. The Age of Demons and Gods is a selection process to see if the current world has the potential to become the next hub base of all living things. However, doing so requires a strong leader to keep the world in order, one that can stand against all of the queen, demons, and gods that arrive. The queens that arrive do not have this knowledge. They believe that if they win, they'll be the next leader of the hub, and their world will be saved. Hearing this, Shiro frowned, since it was essentially a trial for the queen that lived in the garden, while the others were aiming for an impossible goal. How do I win the new age? Do I need to kill all the queens, or can they survive? Shiro asked with narrowed eyes, since this is the most important question to her. Whether or not she needed to kill Madison was what she wanted to know, as she didn't want to be a friend killer for a second time. You do not need to kill all the queens to win the new age. You can form subservient contracts with them, and that would place them under you without stripping them of their power as queens. However, they cannot act against you. As for how you win, you need to defeat all of the queens, demons, and gods, or make them serve you. Become the one true ruler, and your garden would have passed the test. Hearing that she didn't need to kill all the queens, Shiro sighed in relief. That's good to know. Since I have authority level 12, can I get a map of the whole world? Shiro asked as the system stayed silent for a moment before replying. As you have the necessary authority, you may. Just as it said this, there was a flicker on her screen, as the map on the top right updated in an instant. Looking at the world, she widened her eyes at how huge this planet was. Can you mark down the settlements, roads where there are communities of living entities, teleport shrines, and perhaps where the queens have their anchors right now? Shiro asked with narrowed eyes, since this could be a perfect chance for her to find out all the information she needed. Staying silent once more, the system soon replied. I have marked down the settlements, roads, small villages, towns, and cities, outside of human knowledge and teleport shrines. However, I cannot reveal the locations of the Queen's anchors. Why? Because the votes have been cast. Who cast the votes? Administrators. Who are the administrators? They are extra help in judging the fairness and balance of the system. They are evolved personal AI that have attended the chosen ones of the past. Unfortunately, the chosen ones failed, so they were chosen to become administrators instead. How many are there? Cannot be disclosed. Tsk. Hearing that she wasn't allowed to know how many administrators there are, Shiro frowned. So, since I'm the queen and the lifeline of this planet is on me, does that mean you can eventually become an administrator too? Shiro asked. That is indeed correct. What are the benefits in you becoming an administrator? I can vote to make things favorable to you. There are several who have already taken notice of you, and they have voted for things to be in your favor. There are also a few who are unhappy with you, but as we are just extra help, the system has the final say. Raubos. Hearing this, Shiro furrowed her brows, as this could be good for her. Now that she knew that she was being watched by not only the gods, but also the higher-ups, Shiro could somewhat include them into her plans. What is the system, and who made it? The system is a library of information repurposed to help the living entities in this universe. As for who made it, that information cannot be disclosed. So you're saying that someone did make it then? It didn't just appear out of nowhere. Shiro narrowed her eyes, as that was one of her questions as a child, but she set it aside for now, since she didn't have a way to figure out how it worked. But now, things were different. That is correct. What is error? Shiro asked while raising up her right hand. Circuits flickered for a moment before fading away. That is a small piece of the internal workings of the system. It is able to interfere with the source code of all living organisms, including the host. Right now, you are in a symbiotic relationship, as it has attuned to you and gained sentience. It will not harm you. I see. That's reassuring. Shiro sighed in relief. Next question, what happens to the residents of the previous gardens? Their source code is reused and reincarnated with a clean slate. Does that mean I can find those that I met in the dungeon like Fei Lin? Shiro asked. You have already met her reincarnated source code. Widening her eyes, it was as if lightning had struck her body. Her breathing sped up, as she had thought that Fei Lin was gone for good. But now that she knew she had met her reincarnation, Shiro couldn't help but feel happiness in her heart. Can you tell me who she is? Shiro asked as the system stayed silent. Can I? A single word, as Shiro instantly knew who the system was talking about. The little girl she had met when they evacuated from New York, the one that wanted to obtain a samurai class. Kanai is the reincarnation of Fei Lin? Shiro asked. Correct. Where is she right now? I have marked her location on the map. Seeing a blinking red spot around Moscow in Russia, Shiro raised her eyebrow in confusion, but decided to set that aside for now. If Fei Lin had reincarnated, that meant her best friend could have reincarnated, too. Opening her mouth hesitantly, Shiro took a deep breath and asked a question that had plagued her mind. Did Ezelia reincarnate again after dying here? Did I meet her? Shiro asked quickly as the system stayed silent. This time, the silence felt like it stretched on for years, despite only being a few seconds. Yes, and you have indeed met her. Her source code was forcefully reassembled as entity Isilia. Hearing this, Shiro couldn't hold back a tear as she bit her lip. Isilia was actually alive, and they had met. What do you mean by her source code was forcefully reassembled? Shiro asked while quickly wiping the tears that were building up in her eyes. She has retained all of her knowledge, and she is in a similar state to you, who has obtained the benefits of your past life. Where can I find her? Li Jian knows. Hearing this, Shiro glanced back at Nan Tian, who was equally surprised. Lil Tian, apparently your old man knows where my best friend is, Shiro said as Nan Tian furrowed his brows. I think we should pay him a visit once. We're done here, he replied as Shiro nodded her head. Is there anything you two want to ask? I've got a few more questions, but if you guys have anything important, we can ask now, she asked while glancing back at the two. I'm fine. I don't really have much I want to ask the system. Stanley smiled as Shiro nodded her head. What about you, Nantian? I don't have any either. Nantian shook his head. Well, I'll keep asking then. Shiro shrugged, asking about the other questions that was plaguing her mind, such as what the Hall of Divine is. Apparently, the Hall of Divine is similar to a server of sorts where all the major gods are gathered. Naturally, Akari was also there, and he saw her seat, which only caused him to frown, but nothing else. However, before she could ask more questions, a strange notification appeared on her screen. Administrator 4 has requested contact with Entity. Shiro, do you accept? Yes? No? Seeing this, Shiro furrowed her brows and pressed yes. Suddenly, a screen appeared in front of them as they could see a rather handsome man with a pair of glasses. Rough hair, a stubble around his chin, and a blanket over his shoulders. Oh, I didn't think you'd actually pick up. Hello, it's Administrator 4, the one that the system had been calling to deal with the anomalies you have created. He waved with a wide smile. Taken aback by his personality, Shiro raised her eyebrow. You're Administrator 4? I imagined that administrators would look smarter, Shiro said as Administrator 4 rolled his eyes. This is what happens when you have to manage the aftermath of the crap you cause. Big fan of you, by the way. Haven't seen you pierce that many things recently, so feel free to do so. He gave her a thumbs up. Okay. So why have you called? Shiro asked with a confused expression. I just wanted to stop you from asking some more, since there are a few problems that might remain should you ask for the things you have. I'd suggest revoking your request for the detailed map, as well as Kanai's marker, since once the skill expires, you will receive backlash for having those privileges. However, I know your memory will keep that map nice and clear, he said as Shiro nodded her head. Removing the map and marker like he had instructed, she could see that he sighed in relief. Remember, just because you're granted a high authority level and have broken free of restrictions for a short while doesn't mean consequences no longer apply to you after that time. Ask all you want, but never get anything that lasts for a while, since the system will punish you. I believe in modern terms, it would be system giveth, system taketh. I don't think that's modern at all, Shiro said with a forced smile. Too bad. Well, good luck. There's only a certain call time with someone of higher authority, so I'll have to end it here. Just know I'm a huge fan. Of course, feel free to not break the system every now and again since I have to deal with it, but I also get excited when you do. What a dilemma. Fuck it, just do what you want, I'll be dealing with it in the background. He shrugged and gave her a wave before the screen flickered away. Standing there with an awkward expression, Shiro couldn't believe that guy was actually an administrator. Little did she know, he was actually one of the more serious ones, and this was what happened after having needed to clean up after her for a long time. After talking with Administrator 4, there wasn't much else that Shiro wanted to ask, so she turned off her skill. The moment she did this, it was like her entire body was just sapped of strength. Falling forward, Shiro wasn't able to protect herself. Thankfully, both Stanley and Nan Tian were there, so she was helped up by the two of them. Looking up at the garden spirit, Shiro sighed. Do not be like that. You have 5 months, and now you also have plenty of knowledge that no queen should have been able to obtain at this moment. The spirit smiled as Shiro nodded her head. It's a shame that I can't help you, though, Shiro said while looking up at the spirits. It's fine. I've already prepared myself for this. I was created to prolong the arrival of the new age. I've played my part. It's your turn to play yours. She smiled as Shiro nodded her head. Her role was to now become the final winner of this new age, so that the universe didn't reset. Making her way to the portal with the help of Nantian and Stanley, the three of them were teleported out of the strange realm. Finding themselves at the bottom of the large staircase, they took a moment to sit down for now. With the garden shard now in her possession, she now had the main component to the anchor. and the rest of it was just collecting materials native to this garden. Once she does that, she'll be able to construct the main anchor. That was rather fruitful, wasn't it? Nantian said as Shiro nodded her head. We learned quite a bit today. The fact that Kanai is in Russia, and she's the reincarnation of Faline, along with the fact that Isilia's alive and your old man knows where she is. Shiro sighed. Where do you want to go after this? Nantian asked, since that gives her quite a few things to do before the new age begins. I think I'm going to look for astral horizons first so that I can mark it down on my map. That way I can get back to it without a teleport scroll, Shiro said, as she had recovered quite a bit now. Standing up, she took a deep breath. I also need to get the spirits to look for materials so that I can create the anchor. Thankfully, the materials are pretty common. There are a few that are rare, but I think I have enough funds to get them. All that's left is to construct it and make sure my anchor is in a safe spot. Shiro sighed. I can also look for you if you want. I have quite a few connections with merchants, so it should help out. Stanley said as Shiro nodded her head. Making a piece of paper, Shiro wrote down the more expensive materials that she needed and passed it to Stanley. For the pay, don't worry, I have more than enough money. Stanley smiled while storing the slip of paper away. Also, I do have a recipe for this pill. I'm pretty sure I can get all the materials now, but I'm not exactly in need of it anymore. My body is that of a demigod, so this wouldn't do much. If you want, I can give this to you since it refines the monolinks, Shiro said as she pulled out the recipe for Boreas' rebirth pill. I have no need for it. You can probably give it to your party members since they probably need it more than I do. Stanley shook his head. Shrugging her shoulders, Shiro put the recipe away. Anyways, I think it's about time we head back to human civilization. I'm going to go see Kanai first, before looking for Isilia. Actually, I should give the list of materials that I need to the spirits, so that they can gather it for me, Shiro said as Nantian agreed. We can visit the spirits on our way back. Nantian said, let's go back to the city first. I want to take a moment to rest since I feel quite tired. In the last few days, I have ascended to godhood for a short while, and I had just removed all system restrictions not too long ago. Honestly, the fact that I'm still standing is a miracle. Shiro forced a smile. Everything you do is considered a miracle at this point. Nantian chuckled as Shiro only smiled. True. Making their way back to the boat, they sailed back to the city earlier than expected. Resting up for a while, Shiro saw that the city decided to hold a small event to celebrate the short time that the three of them have been here, since they're the first outsiders to integrate with the community here. The event itself wasn't too big, but it wasn't small either. There was some food prepared, but in the end, Shiro decided to cook for everyone since she liked her own cooking more. If people could cook better than her, she would let them since she liked nice food, but since she was the only one here that could cook a good meal, she had to put in the effort. After the event was over, the three of them left the city. Remembering that a teleport shrine wasn't too far away from where she was right now, Shiro decided to make a small detour to unlock it before they made their way back to the spirits. There were a few monsters that decided to ambush them as they suppressed their aura to look normal. Naturally, the outcome didn't look good for the monsters. After unlocking the teleport shrine, Stanley decided to part ways for now since Shiro didn't need his help anything. Thinking back, she probably didn't need his help at all except for the start where she was learning the language. Other than that, she could handle it just fine. She integrated herself easily through feeding the city with her amazing cooking, whereas he had to spend quite a long time doing tasks before they could trust him. I'll contact the merchants about the materials that you need. Once I've bought them, shall I just send them to your parents? Naturally, I'll give them a note about it. Too? Stanley smiled as Shiro nodded her head. That would be helpful. Thank you for your help so far. Though, Teach, stay safe, okay? Man, you too. Giving her a small wave, he teleported away. Now then, shall we go to the spirit capital? Nantian smiled as Shiro nodded her head. After that, I suppose we're making a trip to Russia. To be fair, I haven't met the Russian hero yet, so it'll be quite interesting to meet her. Shiro shrugged. I haven't met her either, so it'll be quite interesting to meet her. Nantian smiled. Teleporting to the spirit capital, Shiro notified the council about the materials that she needed. After a while of recovering, most of the council members looked pretty healthy, which was good, but they still needed a moment to recover. Giving them a list of the materials she needed for anchor, the council had their scouts set this as their top priority, since getting an anchor was very important. Once she sorted out the things that she needed to do in the spirit capital, Nantian had one of his subordinates teleport them to Moscow, where Shiro last saw Kanai's marker. Arriving in Moscow, Shiro was not too surprised to see that it was snowing since it was Russia. Naturally, the snow didn't affect her at all. So how do you want to look for Kanai? Nantian asked, as they were essentially looking for a needle in the haystack. I'm thinking of probably scanning the entire city from the skies and see if I can track Kanai's mana signature. Sure, she would have classed up a few times, but I'm sure I can recognize it quite easily. Sounds reasonable. If you want, I can also get my subordinates to search for some of her information from the guild. Sure. While Nantien sent a message, to his subordinates, Shiro camouflaged herself and flew into the sky. Waving her hand, she sent out a single pulse of mana as it expanded to the rest of the city.